Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Ezra chapter 10, and I'm going to read the first few verses of Ezra. Gloss over the list of names because again, I did such a horrible job of pronouncing them. And then the last verse is very interesting. So there's a couple of verses that's between both of those that phrase. I want to talk about again this issue of again divorce, marriage, and divorce because this book here in Ezra chapter 10 gives a side of divorce that I rarely hear people talk about. And let me do this. Let me get to let me read. And by the way, this is the last chapter of Ezra, and this is how he closes out the book. So in chapter 9, remember people came to Ezra and said, "Hey, man, the people are sinning by marrying outside of the nation and marrying." And he said, and the priests and the leaders are the ones who are leading this. They're worse. And so Ezra was furious and he was humiliated. He prayed. And so this is where we pick up with this. So verse 10, chapter 10, verse 1 says, "While Ezra prayed and confessed, weeping and falling face down before the house of God, an extremely large assembly of Israelites, men, women, and children gathered around him. The people also wept bitterly." Now, this is interesting because again, everybody was very concerned. Remember, they're just coming off of the 70-year exile where God meant business. And you guys sin. I've been telling you not to sin, and now very touchy here because we're falling back into sin, right? Verse 2 says, "Then Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, and Elamite, responded to Ezra." Now this is very interesting. Now listen to this guy here. He says, "We have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the surrounding peoples, but there is still hope for Israel in spite of this." Now, this is kind of interesting here. He's getting ready to give a resolve for this. Verse 3, "Let us therefore make a covenant before our God to send away all the foreign wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, and of those who tremble at the command of our God, let it be done according to the law." Then to get up, for this matter is your responsibility, and we support you. Be strong and take action. So, in other words, how are they going to rectify this great sin? Notice he says here, send away the foreign women. I'm going to come back to that. I want you to kind of, why is God doing this? Okay? Why is he doing this? And here's the thing, because obviously all marriages are not marriages in the sight of God. All marriages are not marriages in the sight of God. Think about that. All right. Verse 5, "Then Ezra got up and made the leading priests, Levites, and all of Israel take an oath to do what had been said." So they took an oath. Ezra then went from the house of God and walked to the chamber of Jehohanan, the son of Elishibet, where he spent the night. He did not eat food or drink water because he was mourning over the unfaithfulness of the exiles. And they circulated a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem that all of the exiles should gather at Jerusalem. Whoever did not come within 3 days would forfeit all his possessions, according to the decision of the leaders and elders, and would be excluded from the assembly of the exiles. Now, one of the things that they could not execute him because they were now, remember, under the rulership of the Medes and the Persians. Okay. Verse 9. So all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered in Jerusalem within 3 days, and on the 20th day of the 9th month, all the people sat in the square at the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. So kind of they were sitting out in the rain, right, literally. Verse 10. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, you have been unfaithful by marrying foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Therefore, make a confession to Yahweh, the God of your fathers, and do his will. Separate yourself from the surrounding peoples and your foreign wives. Now, one of the interesting things about confession, when you think about the confession here, the word confession simply means to agree with. So basically what they're saying, when you say I'm confessing, so when you say, for example, I'm confessing my sin, I'm agreeing with God, I'm acknowledging to God, I agree what I am doing, Lord, is wrong according to your standards. Okay. Verse 12. Then all the assembly responded with a loud voice, yes, we will do as you say. But there are many people, and it's the rainy season. We don't have this stamina to stay out in the open. This isn't something that can be done in a day or two, for we have rebelled terribly in this matter. Let our leaders represent the entire assembly. 14 again. Let our leaders represent the entire assembly. Then let all those in our towns who have married foreign women come out at the appointed times, together with the elders and judges of each town, in order to avert the fierce anger of our God concerning this matter. Only Jonathan, son of Asahel, and Jaziah, son of Tuvah, Tyvik, sorry again, butchering these names, opposed this, with Meshullam and Shabbathi, the Levite, supporting them. So in other words, you had people that were saying what the problem is, right? What they, which is kind of interesting in itself, because you could probably look at these men and then say, okay, you oppose this, why? Here is what the Word of God says. So why do you oppose this? Now, what probably was more likely is these were also men who were evil, that they wasn't following the way of God. Besides the fact that they probably liked their foreign wives, right? Which is why they married them in the first place. Yes. Verse 16, the exiles did what had been proposed. Ezra the priest selected men who were family leaders, all identified by name, to represent their ancestral house. They convened on the first day of the 10th month to investigate the matter. And by the first day of the month, they had dealt with all the men who had married foreign wives. Now, this was widespread throughout the remnant of the people. Okay, so this was widespread here. Then that the following were found to have married foreign women from the descendants of the priest. Now, these were the leadership. So I'm not going to read all of this. Okay, I'm just going to read this first through 19 and then just kind of skip over it. Verse 18 again, the following were found to have married foreign women from the descendants of the priest, from the descendants of Joshua, son of Jodagat, and his brothers, Manasseh, Eliziab, Jerub, and the Gedaliah. So again, sorry for butchering these names. That's why I'm not going to read all the rest of them. But look at verse 19. Look at verse 19 here. They pledged to send their wives away, and being guilty, they offered a ram from the flock for their guilt. Now let me, again, look at all these names here, by the way. These are the leaders, these were the priests that had married foreign wives. And think about this now, that some of these, notice this, notice when he says right here, the priests, right? The Levites, these are leaders, the singers, the gatekeepers, the Israelites. Now, think about this. These were all people that were involved in the leadership. How do you think being married to pagan wives would have affected Israel in their walk with God? Okay? So, look at, we come down to verse 44. And he says, now all of these had married foreign women. And then notice he says right here, and then some of the wives had given birth to children. Now, a couple of problems here, and this is always the problem with sin. The children suffer, right? In other words, the foreign women and then the children. Now, there's a wide difference, okay, in a foreigner like Ruth and Rahab who embraced the God of Israel. That's the difference. These were just foreign women. They had not embraced God, had not renounced their paganism. So they were contaminating the holy seed. And thus, had it continued, the people would have been in the same kind of sins that got them exiled in the first place. Now, the question I want to deal with is this statement here, not all marriages are marriages in the eyes of God. Now, why do I say that? Because when we talk about marriage, now, of course, in our culture, marriage is a covenant, it's a legal document. So you don't need God to get married in our culture. Now, of course, to me, the idea of marriage is based upon, of course, biblical principles. However, what you're going to see here is that God does not join two. He doesn't join everyone or every couple together as one flesh. That's the point I wanted to make from this. And as a result, you see here that God had expressively told them not to marry, right, these foreign women. So when they married them, excuse me, did God recognize those marriages? No. And this is why they sent them away. So all marriages are not marriages in the eyes of God. Now, when we come to today, it's the same thing. Under the Christian faith, the church, who do we marry? So, and Paul dealt with this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Obviously, I'm not going to do a deep dive into this. But what you have in the Old Testament was that the nation of Israel could only marry a person that was in the nation of Israel, the exception being if someone proselyte or converted to Israel and embraced the true God. As I said, like Ruth and Rahab, okay? And then there are also men as well. When you embrace, therefore they could marry, and God would recognize that marriage. So in short, what is a marriage in the sight of God? Well, when God joins two and makes them one flesh, that's a marriage in the sight of God. Okay? In our customs, a marriage is based upon a law, a covenant / law. That is why I can divorce my wife under our law system, but as a believer, cannot divorce my wife. I'll get to that in a moment. Under the Old Testament, Moses gave one clause one excuse, one law that could end a marriage, and that was in the case of adultery. You could divorce your wife in that case. It is unclear if a woman could divorce her husband in the case of adultery. All right, it's just unclear. However, what is clear is that adultery certainly was the only reason a marriage could be dissolved under the law of Moses. When we come to the New Testament, then we see that Paul expands this to the body of Christ, so that marriage should only happen between two Christians. Now, the interesting thing, though, that in 1 Corinthians, Paul dealt with something else that came because the Christian faith went global and wasn't limited to just land as Israel was. Okay? So now you had a situation where a person would come to Christ, but their husband or wife did not. That was a mixed marriage. And how Paul dealt with that, he said, well, stay with them if it's feasible. Stay with them because you might win them to Christ. However, he said, if they depart, let them. You are not bound or in bondage in that case. But then he expressly said, this command I'm giving you straight from God, that between two believers, there is no divorce. In other words, you cannot divorce. You cannot, under any circumstances, divorce. He says, but if you separate, then you must remain unmarried. In other words, you cannot divorce and remarry. In that case, between two believers. So I'll give you an example. My wife, is a godly woman, and I cannot divorce her because she burned the biscuits. Okay, we cannot get divorced because of irreconcilable difference between us. God joined us together as one flesh. No divorce. Okay, she cannot divorce me because I don't have any hair. Okay, all right. But let's say, for example, we get into it and we just don't get along, and we said, okay, you know what? I'm going to separate. Paul says, okay, maybe for the sake of peace, then you just can't remarry. Now, so the conflict would be is, can my wife divorce me? She can divorce me according to the law of America, but in the sight of God, I am still married. Now that opens up a whole nother kind of thing there, because what happens now if I divorce my wife, which God married us in his sight, so we're one flesh. But I'm going to say, okay, you know what? I don't like my wife. She burned the biscuits, right? And I'm going to go and marry another person. In the sight of God, now this is important. In the sight of God, am I married? I divorced my wife. And by the way, a lot of people will even try to use the Old Testament law of adultery. Okay, Paul then clarified that in the New Testament. So therefore, if I divorce my wife, and I'm using my wife as an example because my wife is a godly woman, we're joined together as one flesh. So if I divorce my wife and I marry another woman, am I married in the sight of God? The answer is no. That's why Paul said, if you're not getting along, you may divorce your wife. I'm not divorced. You may separate, but remain unmarried. Why? Because in the sight of God, you are still married. That's the New Testament. That is the New Testament way. So if I go out and marry someone, now watch this. If I go out and marry someone else, I divorce my wife, who is a godly woman, and I marry someone else, in the sight of God, that marriage is not recognized by God. Now, why is that? For the same reason we are talking about here with Ezra. Now, notice the way that when they married the foreign wives, okay, these pagan wives, ungodly wives, sinful wives, God did not recognize that marriage, those marriage. And remember, the way that they dealt with that, oh, where's it at here? They sent them away. Let's see. Oh, look at verse 11 again. Therefore make confession to Yahweh and to the God of your fathers to do his will. Separate yourself from the surrounding peoples and your foreign wives. Okay? And this is what they had, you know, yielded themselves to do. Let's see. And then look at the last verse. And he says in verse 44 again, all of these who had married foreign women, and some of them had wives and had given birth to children. So the sad part was that out of some of these marriages, you had children. But nevertheless, God did not recognize those marriages. As far as God was concerned, one, they never should have gotten married. Just like if I just leave my wife, to have a midlife crisis, I'm going to give me a young woman, 20 years old. God does not recognize that marriage. And by the way, and I'm talking about between Christians now. I'm not talking about the world. I'm talking about between Christians. That's what I'm dealing with. I'm talking about from Christians. And and you know, why doesn't God recognize that? Again, let me go back to using me and my wife as an example. The reason why is because when I married my wife and she married me, God joined us together as one flesh. God sees us as one flesh. That's why he sees us as one flesh. So this is my wife, this is me, we're joined. And that's how God sees us. So if I go and try to marry somebody else, see, I can't. If I try to go marry another woman, in God's eyes, he doesn't recognize that marriage. Okay? He doesn't recognize that marriage. Now, okay, so that is, we close out, what a way to close out the book of Ezra. Now, next study, we're going to get into Nehemiah. Okay, Nehemiah won't deal with this particularly, but Ezra will deal with this. And it kind of gives us an insight to, again, how God views marriage. Interesting. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. See you in the book of Nehemiah.